Shoujo manga has a long and storied history, but one of the most important events in its history happened in the 1970s. That was when a group of young women combined elements from popular fiction, foreign media, and the shoujo manga of their childhood to create daring new works. They weren't the first women to make shoujo manga, but they did expand its style and scope in bold, even controversial new ways. This is the story of the fabulous 49ers, the women who changed the course of shoujo manga forever. And today I shall explain who precisely they were and why they were so influential. As important as they are, there's still much about the fabulous 49ers that's up for debate. The primary reason for that is that they were never a formal group. This was not a designation that these women created for themselves, but one given to them after the fact by literary critics who wished to distinguish them from the more mainstream shoujo mangaka of the day. Not even the name is something that's set in stone, as it has evolved over the course of translation and time. Originally, they were referred to as the Hana no Nijuyonen Gumi, literally the fabulous or flowery year 24 group. Later Japanese scholars would shorten this to just Nijuyonen Gumi, the year 24 group. This phrase would be further translated as the Magnificent 49ers by scholar and translator Rachel Thorne in the mid-1990s, and this is the version that most English-speaking fans are going to be familiar with. Although years later, she would jokingly rue not using the more alliterative version I have been using for this panel. So why do all of these names put so much emphasis on years and numbers? Well, for reasons known only to the critics who coined the name, they decided to group these women around the idea that they were all born in the year 1949, or Showa year 24 on the Japanese regnal calendar. It's a rather strange and specious choice, considering that only a few of them were actually born in that particular year. The rest were spread out over the first 5 years of Japan's own post-war baby boom, from 1945 to 1950. They were part of a generation that benefited greatly from the rapid changes in the Japanese economy, politics, attitudes towards women's rights, and so much more, as well as a boom in shoujo manga that encouraged many young women to start making shoujo manga of their own, in some cases before they even finished high school. So, who were the fabulous 49ers? Believe it or not, scholars can't even necessarily agree upon who does or does not count. While most agree on their most prominent members, the lack of formal definition leaves the rest up for debate. Can any notable shoujo mangaka of the early 70s be considered a 49er? What about the men who collaborated with them as editors? Do we include those who are not necessarily mangaka, but were still friends or associates of the more readily agreed upon members? There's no single right answer to any of these questions, so I consulted as many sources as I could to create my own list. This is by no means a definitive list, but it's the closest I can get to what could be reasonably called a critical consensus. One of the most recognized 49ers in the English-speaking world would be Moto Hagio. She was a studious child and a talented artist from her youth, pursuing a career in manga in spite of her parents' strong disapproval. She would make a name for herself in the 70s and beyond, with her many thoughtful, serious tales exploring the depths of psychology, spirituality, gender, and science. Close behind Hagio would be her longtime associate and former roommate, Keiko Takamiya. Like Hagio, she would be inspired by the many early shonen and shoujo manga she read as a child. She would make her debut at age 18, pitching stories to just about every shoujo manga publisher possible while simultaneously working on a degree in education. Over time, Takamiya distinguished herself not just with her ethereal, dreamlike art, but also by her fondness for science fiction and high melodrama. Ryoko Ikeda has been making manga since her debut in 1967, but she was skyrocketed to international fame thanks to the runaway success of 1972's The Rose of Versailles. It's rather fitting that her best-known manga is all about history and political upheaval, considering she had originally been a philosophy student in college and dabbled with some of the student political groups of the late 1960s. Yumiko Oshima is perhaps not as well known outside of Japan as the last few women I have discussed, but she is no less influential than any of them. Ever since her debut in 1968, she has produced a bevy of short stories that combine delicate artwork with surreal imagery and an intense focus on the anxieties of adolescence. Even her most lighthearted work, The Star of Cottonland, explores the very definition of humanity through the eyes of a kitten who wishes she were human. The same would be equally true for Ryoko Yamagishi. She was inspired in her youth by the illustrations of Aubrey Beardsley and other Art Nouveau era artists. From her debut in 1968 onward, she would use her lithe art to illustrate stories of tormented young schoolgirls in love, a fanciful, psychic-themed take on the tale of Prince Shotoko, and the competitive and psychologically strenuous world of ballet, drawing upon her childhood ballet lessons to expertly capture the dancer's elegant movements. Yasuko Aoike was not necessarily any older than her fellow 49ers, but she made her start as a manga artist far earlier, debuting in 1963 at the tender age of 15. She grew up in a large working-class family, but found inspiration in the pages of shoujo manga and encouragement from her father, who dabbled in inkwash painting. While her early works largely consisted of frothy, giddy romances, her later manga would be defined by a unique combination of comedy, history, and action, along with a healthy dose of homoeroticism. Toshihei Kihara made her debut in 1969 at age 21, making manga while working a day job at a bank. While she made many cute, fluffy, mainstream romances during the 1970s, it was her historical dramas that would bring her critical acclaim, whether it was her adaptation of the French adventure novel series Angélique, or original stories such as her best-known manga, Mari and Shingo. Minoru Kimura is probably the most obscure of the 49ers, even in Japan. She was a contemporary of Yasuko Aoike's, making her debut in 1964 at age 14. She would work on manga during her vacations from high school and college, making a name for herself with a vast array of sensitive, slice-of-life style short stories about young children. So that covers the question of who the fabulous 49ers are, but now we need to address why they were so important in the first place. There are multiple reasons, but we'll start with the one that had the most immediate impact. Their role in the creation of the genre known as boys' love. The credit for this rightfully goes to Moto Hagio and Keiko Takamiya, but it also owes something to a screenwriter and mutual friend of theirs named Norie Masayama. She was a woman with highbrow taste in media, and she shared many of her favorites with her friends in the hopes of inspiring them to write great manga. It also just so happened that many of her favorites happened to involve gay men, whether it was the classic novels she shared with them, or the foreign films from Europe, or even the early Japanese gay manga magazines. Hagio and Takamiya would take that inspiration and use it to start separately working on short stories that were not about the usual starry-eyed young girls falling in love, but beautiful, androgynous young boys falling for one another against the backdrop of historic European boarding schools. Takamiya would be the first to publish hers in 1970, in a short story called In the Sunroom. Hagio would follow a year or so later with her own short story, The November Gymnasium. These works were notable, but they were just warm-ups for what was to come. In 1974, after years of work and a chance meeting with a receptive editor, Moto Hagio would publish what is considered the first boys' love manga series, 1974's The Heart of Thomas. Keiko Takamiya would release her own series, Kaze to Ki no Uta, or The Song of Wind and Trees, 2 years later, after spending years building up her popularity to ensure that her pitch would not be rejected. These two series are different in many interesting ways. The Heart of Thomas is a thoughtful and relatively chaste work. Hagio's focus was not so much on the romantic tension between her protagonists, Yuli and Eric, but instead on their journey of personal and spiritual growth, as they learn to overcome their family issues and cope with the fallout of a love confession from a dead classmate. Meanwhile, The Song of Wind and Trees is a more traditional tragic romance, as the steadfast Serge falls for his roommate Gilbert and strives to help him move past years of emotional and sexual abuse from his guardian. While it was not explicit with its content, Takemiya did make it clear that the boys of The Song of Wind and Trees were doing a lot more than just stealing kisses. Yet these two manga also had a lot of similarities, aside from the obvious one. Both of them were very controversial in their time, not just for their open portrayal of homosexuality, but for their coverage of topics such as suicide and sexual abuse. They also both struggled initially in their serializations, although both were saved thanks to strong book sales and the passionate responses of their readers. These two manga would become not just classics in their own right, but serve as the foundation upon which other shoujo mangaka of the time would build upon, in their own unique and interesting ways. For example, Toshie Kihara would write her own version of a boys' love manga in the late 70s, with a series called Mari and Shingo. The biggest changes she made was to age her characters up slightly and switch the setting from a continental boarding school to early Showa-era Japan, bringing it a little more closer to home for her readership. Meanwhile, others would take the ideas that Hagio and Takemiya conceived and run with them in completely different directions. For example, Yasuko Aoki chose to make her most popular and long-running manga, From Eroica with Love, not a tragic romance, but instead a zany adventure series full of action and espionage, where a world-famous gay art thief chases after both the masterpieces and the German NATO officer he loves, in a scenario that owes a lot more to Lupin III than it does the Heart of Thomas. Boys' love would continue to flourish in manga just like these over the years, until the genre took on a life of its own outside of the shoujo magazines. It would also serve as the inspiration for countless fans wishing to create their own similar stories, and it would become the bedrock from which both comiket and doujinshi culture at large would be built. These weren't the only sort of same-sex stories that the fabulous 49ers were telling, though. They also helped to create yuri manga. Now, novels about tragic lesbian romances between schoolgirls had been all the rage in pre-war shoujo magazines, and while they had mostly fallen out of fashion by the time the 49ers were born, many of them were still considered essential reading for young ladies. Thus, it's not surprising that someone would try to translate these stories to the medium of shoujo manga, starting in 1972 with Ryoko Yamagishi's Shiroi Heya wa Futari, or Our White Room. Many of the 49ers would dabble in yuri over the course of the 1970s, using it to explore the emotional depths of their heroines and the forces of mental illness, rumor-mongering, and the disturbingly frequent reveal of accidental incest that all too often drove them apart. Even when they were working in established genres, the 49ers often used their manga to explore many complex, even feminist concepts. One of these concepts that has generated a lot of discussion and research over the years is how they handled gender. Some of their manga feature characters that were explicitly transsexual, such as Ryoko Ikeda's Claudine or Mota Hagio's They Were 11. These characters were treated not as the subjects of cheap jokes about cross-dressing, but instead as well-rounded people who were often striving to find a place in the world, or in outer space in the case of They Were 11, where they could live and love as their true selves. Others would draw upon tropes from manga of the past and Japanese cultural landmarks, such as the Takarazuka acting troupe, to explore the notion of gender through non-gender conforming heroines. The most obvious example of this is Oscar de Jarger, the heroine of The Rose of Versailles, who was raised as a boy and struggled just as much with the demands others place upon her because of her gender as she does with the turmoil of pre-revolutionary France. The 49ers would also help to bring science fiction to the world of shoujo manga. These women grew up in the glory days of sci-fi, and many of them cited authors such as Asimov, Heinlein, and Bradbury not just as influences, but personal favorites of theirs. So it would make sense that they would try to marry these sorts of emotion and psychological depth that they were creating in their own shoujo manga with these sorts of fantastical stories that they grew up reading. Moto would write many short sci-fi stories over the course of her career that deal with the vagaries of genetics, space travel, and the nature of the mind. But arguably the most prominent example would be Keiko Takamiya's To Terra. This manga follows two young men, one who is cast out from society because of his psychic powers, who ends up becoming the leader of a group of other outcast espers, and the other, an ordinary human who rebels against the supercomputer that oppresses both sides, as they both strive to return to the planet Earth. Not all of the changes that the 49ers made to shoujo manga involved genre or narrative. They also revolutionized the way shoujo manga looked. They utilized a lot more multi-layer, free-form panels and layouts, breaking down the literal boundaries of the page. They let the inner monologues of their characters drift across the page like petals. Their panels were often full of flowers that were not just decorative, but served as visual metaphors for the emotions the characters felt. The imagery itself became more surreal and dreamlike, drawing just as much from modern art as it did from shoujo manga conventions. It should be noted that not all of these techniques were brand new. A lot of the visual language and structures that they used were pioneered by those who were creating the shoujo and shonen manga that they grew up reading. Yet each of the 49ers brought to their art not just their own personal style, but a level of artistic maturity and experimentation that allowed them to enhance the themes and emotional arcs they were trying to write. In combination, they would create montages of stunning, heartbreaking beauty, where panels flowed from one another as freely as water, and characters would drift and swirl through dreamscapes of feelings and flowers. This visual style would become one of the most iconic elements of their work, influencing not just many of their peers, but countless mangaka who came afterwards. The fabulous 49ers have left an incredible impact upon the world of manga. Their work broadened shoujo manga's horizons in remarkable new ways, both visually and narratively. Their complex themes and stunning visuals not only inspired thousands of artists and fans, but brought in new audiences, older, less conventional ones who might not have touched shoujo manga otherwise. Their focus on female perspectives and feminist themes would help lay the groundwork for the creation of josei manga just a decade later. Through the creation of boys' love and yuri manga, they helped to create a space where LGBTQ characters and themes were not just normalized, but humanized, an important first step at a time when such topics were still quite taboo in Japanese media. These manga were not perfect representation. In fact, they were often quite sensationalized, but they would help to pave the way for later, openly LGBTQ mangaka to create stories that better reflected their own lives and their own experiences. The final point I want to make today is this. The fabulous 49ers legacy did not end with the 1970s. They continued to grow as people over the decades as they pursued their passions and their own educations. Some of them would even become educators in their own right, helping to train new generations of mangaka. But most importantly, all of them still continue to create manga. While most of them are not as prolific as they once were, they are still crafting new stories, winning awards, and exploring new genres. The fabulous 49ers are not just a thing of the past, but instead a group of women who continue to grow as artists and shape shoujo manga to this very day. More personal note, if you wish to follow me on social media, you can do so at Twitter. My handle is brainchild129. I've been doing manga reviews for over 8 years at my personal blog, The Manga Test Drive, which is at mangatestdrive.blogspot.com. I also have a side blog, Renaissance Josei, where I post additional reviews and features and other such things. That is at renaissancejosei.blogspot.com. I am an occasional contributor to Anime Feminist, where you can find not only articles by me, but also some podcast appearances. In fact, by the time this goes up, I will be featured as a guest on their watch through of the 1984 version of Glass Mask. And finally, if you like what I do and want to support me financially, you can do so either through Patreon or Ko-fi, both of which you can find me at Megan D. Thank you all for watching and enjoy the rest of Otakon Online.